Federal biologists trapped every single red wolf left in the wild. Not most of them, every one. They put them in cages and declared the species extinct in the wild on purpose. The United States government did not lose the red wolf. It removed it. And then, 7 years later, it was put back. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a single species went extinct twice in the same century, and why the second extinction was engineered not by hunters or loggers, but by a regulatory rule change that made it legally impossible to tell the difference between the animal being saved and the animal doing the killing. This is the story the recovery data has never been assembled to tell in one place. Here is the detail that does not fit the official recovery narrative. At the exact moment, the Red Wolf Program won North America's most prestigious conservation award, 120 wolves in the wild, hybrid pups gone, the science working. The same agency overseeing that victory was quietly signing permits that would cut the population to 7. The documented record begins in 1973. Federal biologists, watching the last viable red wolf population collapse along a narrow strip of coastal Texas and Louisiana, made a decision with no precedent in American conservation history: capture every animal they could locate across the entire Gulf Coast and attempt to save the species in captivity. Over 7 years, they trapped 400 animals. Every individual was genetically tested. Of those 400, 43 were transferred to the Point Defiance Zoo in Tacoma, Washington for captive breeding evaluation. Of those 43, geneticists confirmed only 14 as pure red wolves, not coyote hybrids, not ambiguous intermediates. 14. The entire genetic architecture of a species that once held apex predator dominance across the American South, from the Atlantic seaboard to East Texas, from southern Ontario to the Gulf of Mexico, compressed into 14 animals inside a zoo enclosure in the Pacific Northwest. Think about that. The captive program worked. The first captive-born pups arrived in 1977. A controlled experimental release on Bulls Island off the South Carolina coast demonstrated the wolves retained functional survival behavior outside confinement. By 1987, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had enough biological confidence to attempt something that had never been done before in American history: take a large carnivore species declared extinct in the wild and release it back into open forest. 4 breeding pairs, 8 wolves, were loaded into transport crates and driven to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge on the Albemarle Peninsula of northeastern North Carolina. 120,000 acres of federal pine forest and Pocosin wetland. Another 1.5 million acres of surrounding federal, state, and private land available for expansion. On a cold morning in 1987, those crates opened. For the next 2 decades, by nearly every measurable biological metric, the program was a documented success. The population expanded. The wolves bred. Field teams developed operational innovations that had no prior literature, strategies invented in real time in the field to solve problems that had never been encountered before. By 2012, the wild red wolf population had reached 120 individuals. The hybrid pup problem had been neutralized. The program received the North American Conservation Award. 2012 is also where everything started to go wrong. Before we track the radical, highly litigious biological mechanism this recovery program deployed across the swamps of North Carolina, we need to baseline our own map. Drop a comment right now with the state, county, or province you are watching from, and let us know if your local native ecosystems are currently facing a severe wildlife or land use crisis. Subscribing to this channel ensures you stay pinned to the data as we expose the hidden metrics the mainstream continues to ignore. Now back to the peninsula, because keeping these wolves pure required altering the biology of an entirely different species. What happened next in those 120,000 acres is the part of this story that no single documentary, federal report, or conservation journal has ever assembled into one continuous data sequence. The population expanded, the territory held. And then field biologists encountered a problem that had no existing solution. because no one had ever successfully reintroduced a large carnivore before, which meant no one had ever had to solve what comes after the reintroduction works. The answer they invented would push the wild population to 120 individuals, earn a global conservation award, and then, through a sequence of regulatory decisions that are fully documented and almost entirely unknown to the public, reduce that same population to 7. 7 wolves, in a recovery zone spanning nearly 2 million acres. That is not a decline, that is near total erasure, and the mechanism behind it was not a hurricane, not a disease outbreak, not habitat loss. It was a piece of paper. But back in North Carolina, the eastern population kept going, forcing field teams to invent a strategy that had never been written into a textbook before. The threat was not a predator, it was a relative. Through the 1990s, coyotes, a species that had never historically occupied the Albemarle Peninsula, began moving east into the territorial vacuum left by the recovering wolves. The biological problem was not competition, it was compatibility. Red wolves and coyotes can interbreed, produce fertile offspring, and do so readily when wolf pack density is too low to sustain normal mate selection. Every hybrid litter born in the recovery zone was a genetic dilution event, a quiet erasure of exactly the genome the entire program existed to protect. If the hybridization pressure was not stopped, the recovery would succeed on paper while failing in the field. The solution the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service field team designed was counterintuitive to the point of seeming reckless. Instead of killing the invading coyotes, biologists trapped them, surgically sterilized them, and released them back into the same territory. A sterilized coyote still behaves like a territorial coyote. It still holds ground, still repels other coyotes, still occupies the buffer zones around wolf pack boundaries. It simply cannot reproduce. The sterilized animals became a living biological firewall, not predators, not prey, placeholders. By the mid-2000s, the placeholder system was measurably working. Hybrid pup detections dropped. Wolf pack cohesion stabilized. The wild population climbed steadily toward 100, then past it. The strategy was not just working in North Carolina. Wildlife managers in other countries were studying it as a potential template for their own canid recovery programs. Tracking these multi-layered biological maneuvers and the institutional standoffs that followed requires an audience that values hard, empirical metrics over surface-level environmental storytelling. If you demand this level of investigative ground truth, take a second to hit the subscribe button and join our independent research collective. Now, look closely at the 2012 regulatory ledgers, because this is exactly where local political warfare gutted the entire program. By 2012, the science had won: 120 wolves in the wild, hybrid pup production at 0, a North American Conservation Award on the wall. The placeholder strategy had done exactly what it was designed to do, held the genetic line long enough for the population to reach a self-sustaining threshold. What the biologists had not modeled, and what the data from 2012 onward makes unmistakably clear, is that scientific success and political survival are entirely separate problems, and winning one does not protect you from losing the other. Now back to the story, because 2012 is also where everything started to go wrong, and the gunshot deaths kept stacking. That year, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission authorized nighttime spotlight hunting for coyotes across 5 counties at the core of the Red Wolf Recovery Zone: Dare, Tyrrell, Washington, Hyde, and Beaufort. The stated rationale was coyote population control. The operational reality was a fatal identification problem that anyone with a flashlight and a rifle could have predicted. Under spotlight at night, a red wolf and a coyote are the same animal, same size range, same coat, same eye shine. Indistinguishable. The mortality data is documented: 96 gunshot deaths in a population that had just peaked at 120. Think about that ratio. The federal government's response was not to challenge the rule, it was to retreat. Under sustained local and political pressure, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service froze all new wolf releases into the recovery zone. Then it suspended active coyote sterilization management. The placeholder shield, The biological firewall that had taken a decade to build was abandoned. Without new releases and without coyote management, the pack structure began to collapse. Wild pup births dropped. Then they stopped entirely. In 2019, 0 wild pups were born. In 2020, 0 again. 7 wolves remained in the wild. The program that had rewritten global carnivore conservation, that had been studied, replicated, and awarded, had been functionally ended not by biology, but by a regulatory decision made in a conference room. But the story did not end there, and what happened next, nobody saw coming. Meanwhile, in court filings nobody was paying much attention to, environmental lawyers launched a counter-offensive that completely recoded the recovery, unearthing a massive infrastructural bottleneck that required a $25 million federal intervention. While the public narrative had moved on, while most conservation observers had quietly written the red wolf off as functionally extinct in the wild for the second time in 50 years, a coordinated legal effort was working its way through the federal court system, methodically weaponizing Section 7 and Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act against the government's own program freeze. The argument was not complicated. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a statutory obligation to actively manage a listed species. Freezing releases and abandoning coyote sterilization was not administrative discretion. It was a documented failure of that obligation. Federal judges agreed. Court orders forced the agency back to work. Releases restarted. Coyote management resumed. By early 2026, the documented wild population had climbed from 7 individuals to between 28 and 31, a 150% increase driven not by a new scientific breakthrough, but by lawyers enforcing a law that had been on the books since 1973. And then telemetry data revealed the next problem, one that nobody had modeled. As the recovering wolf packs began expanding their territory eastward across the Albemarle Peninsula, they were crossing U.S. Route 64, a 4-lane highway carrying high-speed commercial and tourist traffic directly through the recovery zone. Vehicle strike mortalities spiked. The wolves that had survived gunshots, political warfare, and 2 decades of institutional collapse were now being killed by truck traffic on a state highway. The Federal Highway Administration's response is documented. A $25 million infrastructure grant authorizing the construction of 11 dedicated wildlife underpasses cut directly through the Route 64 corridor. Not fencing, not signage. Underpasses, engineered passages designed specifically to move apex predators safely beneath 4 lanes of asphalt. This intense confrontation between high-speed transportation corridors and recovering apex predators is unfolding across public lands globally. For those of you watching from major interstate shipping corridors or expanding suburban grids, especially across the American South or East Coast, let us know in the comments if you've seen local transit departments implementing wildlife crossings. Your localized field reports keep our independent mapping accurate. Now look at the final invoice for this multi-decade battle. What the underpasses represent is something more significant than infrastructure. A species saved from extinction by captive breeding, reintroduced by federal biologists, nearly destroyed by a spotlight hunting permit, legally resurrected by environmental attorneys, and now dependent on concrete tunnels beneath a highway to survive its own recovery zone. The question the data forces at this point is not whether the science works. The science has been proven, repeatedly, across 50 years of documented field operations. The question is whether the institutions responsible for protecting it ever will. This is where the story leaves the wolves and starts being about something larger, because a biological victory can be completely erased in a fraction of the time by institutional apathy. Step back from the individual decisions and look at the shape of what the last 50 years produced. 14 animals in a zoo enclosure, a captive breeding program that worked, a reintroduction that worked, a hybrid management strategy invented from scratch that worked, a legal counter-offensive that worked, $25 million in highway infrastructure because the wolves kept dying on the road to their own recovery. Every single scientific intervention succeeded. Every single one. The population still collapsed to 7. That is not a conservation failure. That is a political one. And the distinction matters enormously because it means the limiting factor in wildlife recovery has never been biology. It has always been the question of whether the institutions charged with protecting recovered species are more durable than the political pressure applied against them. The red wolf did not need better science. It needed a more defensible bureaucracy. It needed a regulatory framework that could not be dismantled by a single state agency rule authorizing nighttime coyote hunts. It needed a federal government that would not retreat under local pressure from a management strategy that was, by every measurable metric, working. In the end, the state agency that spent a decade trying to kill the program passed a formal resolution supporting its continuation. That is documented. That happened. It is the closest thing this story has to a happy ending, and it is a profoundly fragile one, contingent on the next election cycle, the next budget negotiation, the next commissioner who decides the wolves are someone else's problem. The red wolf gave the world the blueprint for carnivore restoration. Gray wolves in Yellowstone, recovery programs on 3 continents. All of it traces back, in some documented form, to the decisions made in a zoo enclosure in Tacoma, Washington in the 1970s, and on a coastal peninsula in North Carolina in 1987. The species that built the model for how humanity recovers what it destroys has itself been recovered, collapsed, and recovered again inside a single human lifetime. If saving a species requires an endless matrix of federal litigation and millions in physical infrastructure, do we actually have the collective cultural endurance to save the natural world? Drop your ultimate thoughts below alongside your location, and if this case file permanently changes how you look at ecological data, subscribe to Earth Discovery Series. Because in our next investigation, we stay inside the dense mountain gaps of North Carolina to track another massive institutional blind spot. For nearly 2 centuries, state land managers genuinely believed the Great Smoky Mountains were completely pristine, spending millions of taxpayer dollars on mechanical land mowing and controlled burns to manually maintain the open valley floors. But underneath the surface, the meadows were silently choking out, and unchecked vegetation was completely destroying the hunting grids of native predators. What happened when the National Park Service ignored fierce agricultural resistance and released exactly 52 wild elk into the Cataloochee Valley is a biological masterclass that completely upended every projected engineering timeline, reversing a 150-year habitat deficit in a matter of months and expanding the herd by a staggering 55% per year. We will open that file next. 14 animals. That was what remained of an entire apex predator's genetic future. 14 animals, and the will of a small number of federal biologists who decided that was enough to try. It was, barely, and only because others kept fighting long after the fighting should have been necessary.